Well, ladies and gentlemen, the midterms might be over before they even get started. And the reason why is because of a particular court case before the Supreme Court today. We're actually going to talk about what this could mean for a particular article within the Voting Rights Act. Now, this is always a very, very controversial topic. And of course, whenever there's any mention of it, the left always accuses everybody of being a racist. But there have been some, let's say, some significant problems with elements of the Voting Rights Act. Now, of course, we want everybody who's legally permitted to vote to be able to vote. But when you have to draw districts in the way that this sometimes requires, it does appear not only nonsensical, but at times contradictory. But if this were to change, it could drastically alter the congressional map in the United States. So we're going to be talking about all of that and more on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everybody.
And then, of course, we have our political prognosticator, our resident historian, the Oracle of Virginia, lover and maker of maps. And we got a ton of maps for you today in order to prove our point. Christian Hines, how are you doing, Christian?
Looking forward to it.
So just so you guys know, when we're talking about any number of things on this channel, half the time Christian is over there with his laptop actually making political maps. So this episode's like a dream come true for you.
Not to be confused with the modern day acronym map.
No. Why would you even bring that up?
Why would you bring that up?
Oh my God.
Just
We got to do this. We got to restart that whole intro all over again. Holy cow.
Listen, all right, let's frame this up. All right, this is all about this current Supreme Court case, Louisiana versus, is it Calais?
Oh, if we tried to pronounce it,
whatever,
there'd be somebody from Louisiana that would come back.
So this started off as a lawsuit over Louisiana's congressional map, and now it's a major issue before the Supreme Court because it has to do with respect to things like minority majority districts. Now, to give you, well, do you want to, let's go into just a little bit of background with respect to the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act is partially in response to the kind of the larger civil rights movement that was taking place. And it was this idea of making sure that everybody in the United States was not being deliberately discriminated against by everything from the government to establishments, the economy, et cetera. Because you had significant issues within southern states under Jim Crow laws, which was deliberately gerrymandering in such a way as to minimize the impact of minority voters, specifically black voters within the United States. And so when you had adjustments to the Civil Rights Act, to the Voting Rights Act, the idea is that you were going to have requirements for majority minority districts. But now we're into this weird case where you can literally draw a map to give majority minority districts, but if you draw it in certain ways, it's still considered racist. And so there's been all kinds of Supreme Court battles, court cases about what constitutes a fair and accurate and interpretation of the Voting Rights Act when it comes to drawing some of these districts. Because you can literally have someone claiming that you dissipated the minority vote too much, and so your districts are unconstitutional, or not unconstitutional, but in violation of the Voting Rights Act. You can also draw them in such a way where you theoretically put too many minority voters in one district, and now you disenfranchise them a different way because even though you have a majority minority district, you have too many minorities, which means you could have other minorities in other congressional districts. Essentially, what it's come to be is this. It seems to be all up into judicial interpretation for whoever's looking at that particular time. And it constantly ends up being a source of discussion and argumentation and legal challenges. And now we have a court case where theoretically the Supreme Court could say, yeah, this just wasn't set up well. And theoretically they could say, this is not constitutional based off of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So that's framing all of it up. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. Christian, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me add some brief context to the court case. And I'm actually going to bring up the Wikipedia article for it.
I gave you kind of an overview of some of the issues with the interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. Christian's going to give you some insight into this specific case and why it's been elevated to potentially challenge everything that I just discussed.
Yeah. So I've got this article up here, not because I trust Wikipedia, but actually because it has a left-wing bias. And yeah. I'll explain what I mean in a second, because we've also got a piece from the New York Times that we're going to go through. Yeah. And they're melting down over this, to put it lightly. So the background of this case is pretty simple. Louisiana was given 6 seats in the 2020 census. The Republican majority in the legislature drew a 5-1 map, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 Democrat. The Democrat is in New Orleans. And so it was pretty much unchanged from the previous census. Well, the typical stuff happened, right? You had Democrats using the Voting Rights Act as a means to do this, suing the state and basically saying, you created a racial gerrymander that, the argument was right here that because the state is 30% black, that there needed to be 2 black majority districts, aka 2 Democrat majority districts. You have to understand, for better or for worse, in the South, race equals partisanship.
Mm-hmm.
In a state like Louisiana, Republicans will win easily 80+% of the white vote, and Democrats will win 90+% of the black vote in a state like Louisiana. So this is a ploy to really make a political argument, but pretend that it's not a political argument and say that it's a racial argument.
Mm-hmm.
And so they made the argument that there needed to be a second majority minority district in Louisiana. It went through the court system, and you had a similar case that was going on in Alabama at the time, and this was kind of tied into it. The Supreme Court ruled on the VRA, not on constitutional grounds. They ruled using the VRA as a metric, Voting Rights Act, to determine if this was the case, and the court did rule in the Allen decision that it was. And so what that meant was that Louisiana had to draw a second minority majority district, aka a second Democrat district.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Louisiana did was that they ended up drawing what is now currently the 6th congressional district, which is this hideous monstrosity that goes from Shreveport all the way to Baton Rouge. This was like their only way that they could do this.
Yeah.
That is insane.
So this is what I was trying to articulate before, is that it wasn't as simple as saying you need majority and minority districts. It's the Democrats constantly arguing that you need more of these sorts of districts, even if geographically it makes no sense, right? But the claim is that, well, you're 2 majority minority in this one district, and so you've disenfranchised minority voters. And it really comes to a point where you start to look at this going, okay, this is impossible unless you think this is a good
something
district.
Like that.
Unless you think this is a good district.
That's the problem. So they drew this map because Louisiana was basically forced to do so, and they also had to draw it in a way where they would protect one of their members on the Appropriations Committee in Congress and the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Mm-hmm.
Louisiana actually has 2 of the most powerful members of Congress in the House, and they intentionally drew the map in a way to protect them from losing. And they even said this in the Supreme Court case because they're allowed to do that. And they said, like, look, this is beneficial to our state. We're not going to eliminate the speaker's district.
Yeah.
Like, we want the speaker to be from our state. So yeah, they had to draw it this way. Well, that was interesting because then you had a group of quote unquote non-African American voters,
Mm-hmm.
mostly white, but also some Hispanic voters, that sued in response and said, well, now we're being discriminated against because you intentionally drew a map to benefit one demographic group that cut across the entire state. And in doing so, you've now disenfranchised us from doing that. So that's a constitutional challenge, not a statutory challenge. The Supreme Court was previously ruling on, did these lines violate this law that Congress passed, the VRA? That's a totally different court case than asking whether or not the VRA itself is constitutional.
Mm-hmm.
And so because it immediately became a constitutional challenge, this went straight into the federal court system. And eventually it found its way to the Supreme Court. So you might have a scenario where the Supreme Court a few years ago was ruling to expand the number of VRA districts under the VRA, and then a few years later will actually then rule the VRA unconstitutional because they were just entirely different cases. And so what began as just really a partisan ploy by Democrats to carve out a second Democrat district in Louisiana has now spiraled into a court case to determine the constitutionality of
the VRA
effectively
itself.
The entirety of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Real quick, RA had a question here. He says, am I correct in my understanding that census only counts bodies, not actual U.S. citizens? That is correct. And you want the census to count everybody. The problem is that when you apportion congressional representation based off of the census without differentiating between U.S. citizens and non-citizens, you actually get more districts with non-citizens. Or you get congressional districts which disproportionately represent non-citizens, but still have the same power as a district that maybe represents all U.S. citizens or majority U.S. citizens. So that ends up being a real problem with respect to apportionment in Congress. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to answer that question.
So here's some more context. I've got the New York Times article pulled up here, and there's a reason we're going to be reading from the New York Times, because they are not happy at what's going on.
They're a little bit upset.
It was literally yesterday that the court was having oral arguments on this case. And there were some strong signs that the conservatives on the court are about to use this particular case to upend Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If that were to happen, it would easily be the most consequential political decision that the court has issued in probably 100 years. It would completely, permanently change the function of congressional elections, the makeup of the House of Representatives. It would arguably, not even arguably, it would almost certainly result in the complete elimination of every Democrat seat in the South, with the exception of maybe 3 in the Atlanta metro area, just because there's probably no way that Republicans in Georgia could eliminate them just because of sheer numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But if Section 2 were to be repealed or ruled unconstitutional, or even part of Section 2 ruled unconstitutional, it would completely change our politics. And let me explain how. So, the New York Times article goes on to say, it's talking about the case, right? It says Republicans may not eliminate every Democrat-leaning district that they technically could, more on why later, but the party's aggressive mid-cycle redistricting suggests that it would eliminate enough to obtain a structural advantage going into the midterms and especially going into the 2028 election. Now, here's where things get interesting. And it's here that you realize that this is not just about Louisiana, this is about the entire country. So for the first time in arguably ever, multiple states are redrawing their congressional maps in the middle of the decade.
Mm-hmm.
The way that this normally works is you do a census every 10 years. That census appropriates congressional seats to each state based on that state's population. Then that state draws congressional maps if they're allocated more than one seat. And then they do it all over again 10 years later. Well, multiple states are now redrawing their maps in the middle of the decade in order to give the party that controls that state a better chance of winning the House of Representatives in the 2026 midterm elections. So Texas has redrawn, Missouri has redrawn, California is probably about to redraw. You have a variety of states that are doing this. And this Supreme Court case might end up resulting in a bunch of southern states doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason that Democrats are kind of freaking out, because the New York Times came up with this metric here and said that, if Texas, Missouri, and Utah end up redrawing, Utah's probably going to have to redraw because Democrats successfully sued. Democrats will need a 1.3 percentage margin of victory nationwide in order to flip the House next year. If California redistricts, it's basically an even fight. If Democrats win a majority of the popular vote in the next year's elections, they will win the House. Now, if Florida, Indiana, Ohio, and Kansas also redraw, then it needs to be a D plus 2.5 environment for them to flip the House. Now, if Section 2 is struck down and the southern states redraw to eliminate their Democrat-held, effectively what I like to call their DEI districts, which is exactly what they are, then you would need a blue wave in order for them to barely flip the House of Representatives.
Mm-hmm.
You would need a 2018-style blue wave for them to get 218 seats, which is a 1-seat majority. And so, naturally, this is creating almost like a doomsday scenario for Democrats. Like, this is something that they never thought was even possible. And it not only seems possible, it seems likely that this is going to happen.
There's a couple of things that need to be understood here, is that when you look at certain articles of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and Charlie Kirk got in trouble for this because he was pointing out something that was very important, and to be properly understood, here's at least my position. I believe it was Charlie's position as well. He wanted to make sure that if you're a U.S. citizen and you're of the right age and you're legally permitted to, you can vote. He didn't want to restrict anybody's ability to vote. He also didn't want the United States government to be going in and deliberately discriminating against people based off of race. In fact, Charlie would also say that he didn't want individual businesses coming in and like putting out signs that say whites only or Irish need not apply, right? Like he didn't want that either. But what he did say was that when you look at things like disparate impact, or when you look at what I'm about to read off with respect to the Voting Rights Act, because the problem is now you create perverse incentive structures to actually engage in other forms of discrimination, and long term that just becomes more pronounced. And I also want to appeal to Supreme Court Justice. What's her name? In the 80s. They were trying to
Sandra Day O'Connor.
Sandra Day O'Connor. When they were looking at elements of the Civil Rights Act, and they actually had some court cases going, well, wait a second, affirmative action violates the Civil Rights Act because now you're engaging in other forms of discrimination, and you're not supposed to discriminate based off of race, but that's exactly what you're doing in order to get quotas. And Sandra Day O'Connor, in her opinion, essentially kind of said, yeah, this is problematic, but it's necessary, and maybe, in however many years from now, it will no longer be necessary because we will have reached some sort of, equilibrium or whatnot where now this isn't a significant problem. The problem is in the same time that you're saying, okay, it's bad right now, and so we're going to engage in this kind of reverse discrimination in order to achieve, hopefully a future end state where this is no longer a problem. It will no longer be, quote, necessary. Well, the problem is you create constituencies around the laws that exist. So I want to read off some of the criteria. So I'm reading this straight from the page. It goes, when determining whether a jurisdiction's election law violates the general prohibition of Section 2 of the VRA, courts have relied on factors enumerated in the Senate Judiciary Committee report associated with the 1982 amendments. These are the Senate factors. So here's what it includes. So this is when it looked at This kind of came out of the Brnovich versus the Democratic National Committee. All right, here it goes. The history. So here's how I want you to imagine this. You're looking at a congressional district map, and you're looking at how the state legislature or whatever mechanism the state is, the independent commission or whatever, you looked at how they've drawn the map, and now they're going to analyze this map to see whether or not it has violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Here's what they take into consideration. 1, the history of official discrimination in the jurisdiction that affects the right to vote. 2, the degree to which voting in the jurisdiction is racially polarized. 3, the extent of the jurisdiction's use of majority vote requirements, usually large electoral districts, prohibitions on bullet voting, and other devices that tend to enhance the opportunity for voting discrimination. 4, whether minority candidates are denied access to the jurisdiction's candidate slating process, if any. 5, the extent to which the jurisdiction's minorities are discriminated against in socioeconomic areas such as education, employment, and health. 6, whether overt or subtle racial appeals in campaigns exist. 7, the extent to which minority candidates have won elections. 8, the degree that elected officials are unresponsive to the concerns of the minority group. And 9, whether the policy justification for the challenge law is tenuous. Can I tell you what the problem is with a lot of these criteria? Who says? Right? Everybody in their mind is thinking, so for instance, when overt or subtle racial appeals in campaigns exist. I once saw a member of the Virginia House of Delegates hold up a campaign mailer that was used against him, and it had like a stack of money, and it showed that he wanted to raise taxes. It was true that he wanted to raise taxes. He claimed that this was an anti-Semitic ad against him because it had a stack of coins showing that he wanted to raise taxes. I'm looking at this going, or you just want to raise taxes and they're pointing that out in a visually easy way to determine. Well, now do we got to go to court to determine whether or not that was an anti-Semitic ad or just something pointing out that he wanted to raise taxes? So again, who gets to determine whether or not a subtle racial appeal was made? Because I know the candidate that did the ad was Glenn Youngkin. Glenn Youngkin has signed anti-Semitic, like aggressive anti-Semitic legislation into law. I don't think you're going to sell me on the fact that he was trying to use subtle racial cues to win an election in a Northern Virginia district. Right? So to the extent which minority candidates have won elections, okay, I get it. And obviously we would all say if you had a phenomenal minority candidate and they somehow just always lost, that would be one thing. But now you can look at it as like, okay, were they a good candidate, or did you run minority candidates that maybe weren't as good at candidates because they couldn't fundraise or they didn't message well or they weren't really well known in the district, right? Like in every single, well, not in every single one, but in most of these criteria, what you would be looking at and this ends up becoming the larger argument whenever we talk about civil rights issues or race issues, is that I can look at a situation and I can say, okay, I could chalk this up to racism, or I could chalk it up to a variety of other categories, which might be equally, if not more relevant, that have nothing to do with the race. So how do I differentiate between which one has taken place? And what the left has consistently said is, well, if we win, then it's okay. And if we lose, then it's racist. And that can't be the criteria, right? That can't be the
that's what it is currently.
Yeah, that cannot be the determination on whether or not we had an equitable outcome. If the equitable outcome is the left wins, and every time the left doesn't win, it's racism, well, you don't actually have good law that you can appeal to. You have a heads they win, tails you lose process. And that's become the problem with a lot of these subjective criteria in order to determine what happens. And that's why people are now challenging this, going, really what you have here is a law on the books which says that one racial group in the country are supposed to get representation based off of their race, which the Democrats have tried to organize in such a way to where it means they win, the Democratic Party. I would hope that regardless of where you stand on this, you can at least see the difficulty in faithfully executing this when, again, the Democrats have created a scenario where the only way that we'll be happy with the result, the legal result, is if we win. So,
I mean, it's become I was just thinking to myself when you were talking, like, sovereign is he who defines what's racist.
Yeah.
Is how the judiciary operates, within the VRA framework that Democrats have perverted in order to make it about we want free seats. That's what this, like, people have got to realize that this is actually not about race. This is about we want free seats.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the Democratic Party getting free seats in Congress. If the VRA Section 2 is either fully or partially overturned by the Supreme Court, they don't get free seats in Congress anymore, and that's the reason that they're freaking out. They say here at the end of this article, for example, that in recent decades, 5-point victories in the House popular vote have generally happened during wave elections. And then they gave some examples, 1994, 2006, 2010, 2018, when one party ended up winning a large majority. But only once in the last 30 years has it happened during a presidential election year, which is Obama's win in 2008. But if Section 2 falls, Republicans can redraw districts across the South. Democrats will be at enough of a structural disadvantage that even with a 5-point victory, their chances might depend on upsets in a few heavily Republican districts. Let me show you some visual examples of what we're looking at here. So, this is the map that the New York Times came up with to illustrate kind of the problem that Democrats are facing. This is kind of like the Deep South. I know that some people are going to be upset if they argue that Tennessee and North Carolina constitutes the Deep South. Same thing with Florida, right? But just for a second, humor me. This is the current map. Blue is Democrat, red is Republican. So you've got the map as North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida. And you see it's majority red, but there's plenty of Democrat-held seats in these states. And all these states are controlled by Republicans at the state level. They have complete control over the redistricting that goes on in these states.
Yeah, keep in mind that in most states, the legislature is the one that draws the congressional districts. And so you will say, well, that means that whoever the incumbents are, they can protect their seats. Correct. Right. That is what happens. Now, some people will say, well, that's why you need an independent commission. Can I just say right now, right? There's no such thing, right? You are always going to have partisanship playing in to the way that lines are drawn. That is always going to be the case. The difference is, to some degree, you can actually have the voters rebel against their state legislature. How do they rebel against an independent commission comprised of college professors drawing the lines? So I just want people to understand that I wish I could give you like a fair across the board, this is the best way to do this. This will always be complex. So I just wanted to say that. But
you bring up a great point about, like, voters have the ability to rebel against politicians that they elect. They have no ability to rebel against technocrats whose names they don't know, who are not subject to election, who are appointed by courts, which also aren't subject to election, to then draw these maps arbitrarily. And that's what's happened in Virginia repeatedly. They do that in California. Now I'm going to show you later in this podcast what they're about to do in California.
Yeah.
But
you can see right now why they'd be terrified, because if this is the current map,
here's the current map. This is what would happen
Act.
if Section 2 were struck down.
So basically, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama would essentially have,
and
no
South
Democrat
Carolina would have no
representatives.
Democrats.
Yeah, South Carolina would have. Well, and interestingly enough, before the Democrats watching this get all furious, go look at a map of Illinois. Go look at a map of some of these solid blue states. They have absolutely zero problem having 100% Democrat representation. I mean, not Illinois, but
there's only 3 Republicans.
Yeah,
and there's like 15 Democrats.
Yeah.
Well, you even just look at the map above there. The reason those districts are massive is because they have to take in all of that space in order to, it's interesting, especially that Louisiana one where it's just strung catty corner across the whole state like that in order to scoop up the right people.
Well, in the part, even when you look at a place like North Carolina, you still see that they would still have 2 Democrat seats. What would it be? It would be Raleigh and it would be Charlotte.
Oh, by the way, Illinois actually has 14. I knew that it was 14.
Okay.
I just needed to.
Okay. Georgia would still have Atlanta,
a couple
as
in
a blue
Atlanta.
seat. Florida would have Tampa, Orlando,
and 1 or 2 in
Miami,
3 in South Florida.
Yeah, Miami, and I think that's Palm Beach or
Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach.
Fort Lauderdale is further north.
No, you're right. This is like Boca Raton, just outside Boca. Yeah. Boca Raton's actually kind of Republican, but Broward as a whole, the county, is like the most Democrat part of Florida.
Now, I understand that this law was put into place to deal with southern states doing what they did. But does it apply to everyone, or is it just southern states that trigger this?
Here's how it applies. Are Democrats being disadvantaged? And if so, is it possible to draw a Democrat majority district? If so, then it's applied.
Okay.
That is not an exact.
I know it's not an exaggeration. I wanted the more academic. I wanted the academic.
I'm gonna put myself into the position of the Democrat, and I'm gonna try to steel man the argument. Okay. But before I do that, I want to thank True Classic, because they are one of our sponsors for this podcast. Now, as you know, we love True Classic around here. I am currently wearing one of my favorite black True Classic t-shirts. And my wife was the one that introduced True Classic to me, because she was tired of me wearing a bunch of ill-fitting stuff, because quite frankly, I didn't care. But guys, you should care. You should care how you look for your lady, for your wife, right? And True Classic has got you covered. And it's not just t-shirts. It's active wear. You like to go to the gym? I'm telling you, you're going to love True Classics, because they fit right. So when you're getting your pump on, like you can actually see it feels good in the shirt. Try out their fitness gear. I absolutely love it. Their shorts are awesome. Also, they've got the formal stuff too, right? You need the button downs, right? You need the button down with the t-shirts, maybe something a little bit more summer casual. We're moving into the winter months now. You need more long sleeve. They have got some great Henleys, which is something that Tina loves it when I wear. So I'm telling you, go over to trueclassic.com right now, and you're going to use trueclassic.com/Nick, because you're going to let them know we sent you, right? And that is good for you. It's good for True Classic. It's good for us. It's a great way to support the show. But if you are out and about and you have forgotten to use the link that we provide in the description to go buy your True Classic, not to worry, because you can now find them out and about at the stores, Target, Costco, etc. Go get your True Classic. Again, it has become the vast majority of what I wear now, because it is comfortable, because it is durable, and because it just fits the way it should. trueclassic.com/Nick. Go try them out. Okay, I am now going to give the Steelman argument for this section of the Voting Rights Act and why it should remain in place. All right, here we go. When a country, as wonderful as ours, as wonderful the United States with all their history, but we have our flaws. We have things that we've done wrong, and there is no question that black people were uniquely discriminated against within the United States. And they were uniquely discriminated against in the United States, specifically in the states which made up the Confederacy, and which then went on to institute a whole litany of legislation, laws, statutes, which had one purpose in mind. and that was to discriminate against Black Americans. So it didn't end with the Civil War. It didn't end with Reconstruction. This kept going all the way up through the 60s and even beyond, as various legislatures in the state attempted to put Black Americans at a disadvantage, not just economically, not just socially, but politically. And so, yes, Black Americans decided to coalesce around the political party that they thought were doing a better job of representing their values. Now, for many years, that was the Republican Party. Black voters were Republican. Why Lincoln was a Republican. Frederick Douglass, many others were Republican, associated themselves with the Republican Party because, let's face it, the Jim Crow laws in the South were instituted by Democrat legislatures. But according to the Democrats, the party switched, and then they started aligning themselves more with Democrats as John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson started doing, in their minds, a better job of representing their needs, wants, desires, and their desire to just be equal citizens within their country. And in order to ensure that districts were not gerrymandered in such a way as to deprive them of any sort of practical political capability, political power in states where they made up 20, 30% of the population, the Voting Rights Act was put into place in order to ensure that A, you couldn't do things like coming up with poll tests or poll taxes, which disenfranchised them because they didn't have access to the same economic opportunities or same educational opportunities. Because you can't come up with stupid questions that have nothing to do with, voting in order to disenfranchise Black voters. And that was happening. So all of these different rules were put in place to prevent people from disenfranchising you if you couldn't afford the poll tax, disenfranchising you if you were deliberately put in underfunded schools, which denied you access to a quality education, that created strange standards whereby local jurisdictions could come up with poll tests that made absolutely no sense. All these things were put into place. And then in addition to that, an additional measure was taken to ensure that minority populations, which had been consistently discriminated against, could now have some vestige of political power, both at the state and federal level. And so that's why it was put into place. That's why it was necessary. And it continues to be necessary as there are still structurally racist institutions which seek to disenfranchise Black voters. Would you say that is a fair steelman argument of what somebody, not even Democrats necessarily, but somebody that values Article 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that is the argument they would make? Is that correct?
I would say that is not the argument that the liberal justices on the Supreme Court are making currently.
Okay, but as far as a steelman argument, have I done a fair job of making a steelman argument for Article 2 of the Voting Rights Act?
Well, I guess it depends on what you prioritize, right? Because...
Okay, how would you do it differently?
No. I'm... Hear me out. I'm saying your argument is presupposing certain things as being desirable outcomes, right? It's almost like your argument is presupposing that different outcomes must be attributed to discrimination.
No. Think about the argument I made. What I made is that these things were a fact.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I didn't even make the argument that I kind of did at the end there. I said still structural racism and the whole deal. But a lot of the structural racism
that's what I'm getting at.
Was in the law was taken out. Like, it is now forbidden to put in the kind of structural racism that existed before into the law now, arguably except in reverse, right? But to make a steelman argument, you have to present the argument as best you can from their perspective.
Yes, and if you're operating within a framework that presupposes certain progressive or liberal values, your argument is a steelman argument. Okay. The problem is, I reject those progressive and liberal values.
Okay, but you want to. So, for instance, you're not rejecting there was slavery. You're not rejecting that there was Jim Crow laws. You're not rejecting any of that.
Those like historical laws existed.
Sure. Yeah.
But this idea that we need active political discrimination, affirmative action, which is what that is. That's just why I said these districts in the South are effectively DEI congressional districts. Mm-hmm. Because you would, for example, California is minority white. Mm-hmm. Minority white, not plurality white. It is minority white. Mm-hmm. There are more Hispanics in California than there are whites. Whites are something like 34, 35% of the population in California. Do we have VRA districts for whites in California?
Mm-hmm.
Is California mandated to draw congressional seats that are white majority because they are a minority population in that state? No, they are not.
That was the question I was asking. I wasn't actually asking why they did it or any of that. I was saying,
does it apply equally to everybody? No.
Does it apply?
It does not apply equally.
Well, okay,
okay, hold on. So let's say a northern state, or let's say California, drew their districts to where it completely disenfranchised, which is exactly what they're going to do, disenfranchise Republican voters from the more rural areas, the farmers and the people like that. And they are going to basically draw a bunch more left-leaning districts, or solid left districts, by diluting that vote. So basically, this act does not apply to that. It only applies to. Does it only apply toward racism against blacks or racism against any minority group?
Effectively, it's only racism toward blacks.
VRA districts also exist for Hispanics in Texas, for example. This is why the Republicans in Texas did not crack the El Paso district, which they could have done when they redrew their maps recently. And then I'm going to show you the map for Texas. We've got, in this podcast, we're not just talking about Louisiana, we're also talking about all of these states that are redistricting.
So how
this is a big change from the past.
How is it constitutional to discriminate? So if it's not about the power imbalance within that state, and it's just about how much melanin is in your skin, how do they get away? How do we get away with that?
Because a lot of these things were written from a time when America's demographics were very different than today.
Okay, I understand
this
that.
was written before the Hart-Celler Act. This was written when America was... So
that brings us to why this could get overturned.
Portions
of it.
It's not like America's changing demographics or why this is going to be overturned. This should be overturned because it's unconstitutional, is why it should be overturned.
What makes it unconstitutional?
Because it violates the 14th Amendment. But the reason this is now becoming an issue now is because the framework that was built in the 60s doesn't work in an I would argue it didn't work back then either, but you could at least make the steelman case that Nick was making in 1965 when America was, roughly speaking, 80-something% white, 14% black, and then, 1 or 2, 3% for other minority, Hispanic, Asian, etc. There were some Hispanics like in South Florida and on the Rio Grande Valley back in the 60s.
So, but basically,
America was largely America was largely a white and black country where you had very clear, especially in the South, very clear racial dividing lines, and you had all of that stuff that Nick was talking about. But nowadays, America has become much more of a multicultural melting pot. You have in states like California, you have multiple different ethnic groups that are 15, 20% of the population. California's, nobody's a majority of the state. Hispanics are a plurality, followed by whites, followed by Asians and blacks.
I guess the question is, are we to a point now where so basically, first of all, I guess it's a twofold question. One is, can you explain how it is a violation of the 14th Amendment first? And how it could, like, what parts of this could get overturned as a result, and then also just the question is this something that gave a built-in advantage that was necessary for a time, and then it should have sunset at some point, or once we reach some threshold?
Here's the reason why is it could get overturned based off of the 14th Amendment is because arguably an honest and reasonable interpretation of the 14th Amendment was that it was supposed to protect all American citizens regardless of race. And so now you have these specific protections that were put in that are targeted toward racial minorities. And so the idea is it's the reverse discrimination argument. You saw the same thing with affirmative action. You started to have white people that were saying, I'm being denied a job because of my race. The argument the Supreme Court offered with Republican nominee Sandra Day O'Connor was that, well, this is necessary to make up for past discrimination. You also saw this articulated by Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson's argument that made sense to most people was, you cannot take someone that you have actively discriminated against, drag them up to the starting line, and now tell them you are now free to compete, right? Because you've already created conditions which makes it to where he's not able to compete with the other people at the starting line that didn't have that past discrimination. And so the argument is that what they were doing through things like affirmative action was to try to level the playing field by giving some advantages that made up for the previous discrimination.
So now, where does that expire? Well, how do we find the line?
I'm trying to answer.
Okay.
Now the argument, in most people, now here's the problem though. The way they sold a lot of this stuff initially was not, we're going to give a bunch of advantages and incentives to people based off of the race. It was, we're going to achieve equality before the law. And equality before the law is something that generally makes sense to all Americans. What it has turned into is, well, that's not equitable because the results are not creating what we want. And so the infusion in the 60s was, well, not only are we going to achieve equality before the law, but we're going to add all this additional stuff through affirmative action policies that came on afterwards in order to provide an additional, this will be the springboard. And once we've had this for a while, it will no longer be necessary. Sandra Day O'Connor said as much in her opinion in the decision, I think it was in the 80s, which said that, yes, there will come a time where we will no longer need this with respect to things like college entrance exams. Right, where they were allowing colleges, they were essentially admitting, yes, colleges are discriminating based off of race, but they're able to do that in order to achieve a more diverse student body, which is a net positive for an educational environment. But in the future, this won't be necessary. Okay, when? When will it not be necessary? What is the criteria that we use? You've just admitted that we're now engaging in another form of discrimination to make up for past discrimination. When is that no longer necessary? When have we reached an equilibrium to where now we can all be treated equally before the law? Because even the proponents of some of this said that ideally it wouldn't be necessary. Well, now again, when you create, Thomas Sowell says this best. He goes, when you create advantages and you take away the advantages, it now feels like discrimination. Because I had something and now you took it away. So most Americans were willing to say, yes, this was unfair because of X, and so now we're going to allow for this in order to try to make up for that. And now most Americans are looking at it, and now I wouldn't say most, I would say, let's say a critical mass of Americans are now looking at this going, this hasn't worked. What it's essentially doing now, it's perpetuating various perverse incentives that we no longer want. And nobody gets to say we didn't try. Because there's been decades now of various programs. And what a lot of people are coming back to say is, and oh, by the way, the people that have been most negatively impacted by those programs are the very people the programs were set up to assist. This has not improved conditions for the vast majority of people within this particular demographic category. It's made things worse. So we don't want to do it anymore. We want to say, okay, we recognize there was a problem. We first tried to make up the problem with equal protection before the law. Some states didn't play by the rules. We created additional legislation. That legislation went way beyond the original intent and has now created all these various, rent-seeking entities. We want to get rid of that too now. And that's the part where, again, if you're a Democrat, you're thinking, well, all this means for me is I lose seats.
Yeah, listen to the argument from Justice Jackson on the Supreme Court. This is from
bizarre.
So listen to this. This is a minute and a half long.
I'm thinking of the fact that remedial action, absent discriminatory intent, is really not a new idea in the civil rights laws. And my kind of paradigmatic example of this is something like the ADA. Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act against the backdrop of a world that was generally not accessible to people with disabilities. And so it was discriminatory in effect because these folks were not able to access these buildings. And it didn't matter whether the person who built the building or the person who owned the building intended for them to be exclusionary. That's irrelevant. Congress said the facilities have to be made equally open to people with disabilities if readily possible. I guess I don't understand why that's not what's happening here. The idea in Section 2 is that we are responding to current day manifestations of past and present decisions that disadvantage minorities and make it so that they don't have equal access to the voting system, right? They're disabled. In fact, we use the word disable in Milligan. We say that's a way in which you see that these processes are not equally open.
How are they disabled?
They're disabled.
Okay, so look, I'm going to attempt to steel man this argument.
I hate it when you do that.
I'm going to attempt to steel man this argument.
Can it not be like 15 minutes
Yeah,
like the previous
let's not
one?
filibuster it, please. Can you do it concisely?
Let's do blitz round, steel man.
Okay. So essentially what she's saying is that, again, the argument against this is that people are not engaging in the sort of systemic racism that they did before.
Right.
So what we're saying is we don't need this anymore because we don't have Jim Crow laws on the books.
I'm there with you.
And generally speaking, people are not, overwhelmingly racist in the United States. And what she's saying is, well, that doesn't matter. The intent of the people or the intent of the legislatures doesn't matter. Conditions have been created which essentially make it harder for minority populations. Now, you notice when they talk about minority populations, they're not talking about Japanese American, right? They're not talking about Indian Americans generally. She's usually talking about Black Americans, maybe Hispanic Americans.
She used the word disabled, which is why
Okay. The reason why she used disabled is she's saying that if I build a coffee shop and I don't have a ramp for people in a wheelchair, and I don't have a bathroom for somebody that can get in because wheelchair accessible, I might not have done that because I didn't like people in wheelchairs. I might not just have thought about it. But the effect is that a person in a wheelchair does not have the same access to my coffee shop as somebody that is not in a wheelchair. And what she's saying is that is the reality of America for minority populations.
Right.
And so we have to have something like the Civil Rights Act to ensure that they get similar access. Okay. That's her argument.
So I totally understood what her argument was. The point I was making is she used the word disabled to describe minority voters, almost as though do people it's this idea of I
bigotry
can walk up and go vote. How are you unable to go and vote? There's like every possible way to vote. You can have your ballot mailed to you. You can jump on a bus and go down and vote for 45 freaking days before election day in person, or you can just go to your voting location in person. How is any race less able to get to the polls than any other race, especially considering we have polling locations strategically placed in everybody's area within probably close to walking distance, except for some of these rural areas, which puts, I guess, rural people at a disadvantage. So I don't understand why you would use the word disabled when describing someone of a minority race with voting. Why would you say disabled?
Because you left out the most important part that I'm going to keep hearkening back to. You said, how are they going to get to the polls? And you should have said, how are they going to get to the polls and elect a Democrat? No. That like we keep talking about this like this is some ethereal neutral concept, and we're talking about these things in the abstract. They don't exist in the abstract. This is not a ethereal neutral concept. This has an explicit political. We're talking about politics here. This has an explicit political outcome, and that political outcome is always been to elect Democrats. There are not VRA districts that are electing Republicans. I brought up the analogy before. Does California draw white majority districts for, say, rural Republicans in what they like to call the state of Jefferson in Northern California? No, they're about to abolish that district, the first district in California, in order to gerrymander the state to be more Democrat. Yes, it's outrageous that they're doing this, but they're revealing the outrage in some of their follow-up comments. So we saw the Supreme Court justice, but this is what Gavin Newsom has to say. And this is really what the real story is. Trump is about to steal 20 seats in Congress. That's what the real outrage is.
Yeah.
It's not about, whether or not the voters are, or the minority voters are being disenfranchised. It's whether or not the Democrats that they're electing are being disenfranchised. And here's another example. If Section 2, this is just some random account. If Section 2 of the VRA is gutted, leading surely to a wave of racial gerrymandering to crack black voters across the South, I will not consider the 2026 midterms fair or democratic at all. The social contract of democracy will be broken.
Of democracy.
And this guy ended up getting ratioed here by yours truly. If my side stops being given free congressional seats, the social contract will be broken. Like, this is where we're at here. And to visualize, I showed you guys this map earlier. This is just one component of a broader redistricting fight that's going on across the entire country. So I want to give you guys some visual illustrations of what's going on here. This is a map of Texas's congressional districts before they redrew their lines earlier this year. And this is according to the 2024 presidential results. Now, what's interesting about this is that there's a couple of seats here that are currently held by Democrats, these in the Rio Grande Valley, this one and this one. And then there's this one that stretches from Austin to San Antonio. There's an extra one in Houston, and then there's an extra one in the Dallas metro area. This is the new map that they just passed in Texas. And you can even just look at the two of them and see visually the difference. The Rio Grande Valley district's got a lot redder. The connecting district between Austin and San Antonio got destroyed. Al Green, you guys know who Al Green is. He's that obnoxious member of Congress that will just stand up there and like shout at the president during the State of the Union until he has to be escorted off the floor by the sergeant at arms. His district became like Trump plus 20. So he's gone.
Bye-bye.
He's gone. The extra Democrat seat in Dallas ended up being drawn out to like Tyler, or at least actually Tyler's down here, but out to East Texas, so she's gone. And so this will flip 5 seats. Well, Texas is not the only state doing this. Missouri did the same thing. This is the old Missouri map, and this is the new Missouri map. So goodbye, Kansas City seat.
Yeah.
And also, Ann Wagner's seat got much redder because Ann Wagner is a counter-signaling subversive who insulted her own rural. Get this. So Ann Wagner, Republican member of Congress, Rhino Republican. When Missouri Republicans were trying to redraw the map, she attacked the legislature and said, privately was saying, I don't want to be drawn into these like hicks out in the countryside because they're crazy lunatics. Those are her voters.
Yeah.
And she was insulting them. And she demanded that she be given more of suburban St. Louis because she's more of a Rhino Republican, even though it made her district bluer and harder for us to hold on to because she was scared about getting primaried from the right. Well, luckily, we rectified that fact and we also cracked the Kansas City district. So we picked up another one from that. And finally, here's California. Here's Gavin Newsom's response. So this is the current map, again, under 2024 presidential lines. And there's that district I told you guys about in Northern California. And so this is the current map. California is retaliating against Texas. And this is what the new map is going to look like. And it's...
That's nuts, too, because Northern California... where
that entire area up there is red.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're drawing it down to the Bay Area.
Yeah.
These districts, like, the counties up here, again, like the Jefferson area, they're drawing these districts down the Pacific coast all the way to like Marin and stuff, like everything on the north side of the San Francisco Bay from San Francisco.
Yeah.
Is like going to be one deep blue district. Same thing with the second. They've cracked the Sacramento metro area to the point that the third district now has been obliterated. And even like the 9th and 13th, which are currently held by Democrats, but Trump narrowly won them, those have been blown up. And there's 9 current Republican members of Congress right now. And Trump won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 seats. And he almost won 12. There's this one in Orange County.
Yeah.
And this map reduces that 12 to 4.
Yeah.
Actually, technically 5. The 22nd did barely vote for Trump. And so the goal is to flip 5 Republican seats to offset Texas. So they might end up canceling each other out. It might still be a net gain of 1 because we might actually be able to hold on to the 22nd still. So that's what California's up to. And here's where things get really interesting, though, because Kansas is doing the same thing. The legislature in Kansas, which has the votes to override the Democrat governor, has called a special session for the explicit purpose of destroying the other Kansas City seat on the other, and the Kansas City is interesting because it's half Missouri, half Kansas. So, and Democrats currently hold both on both sides of the state line. They hold congressional seats. Well, Missouri destroyed theirs. Kansas is about to destroy theirs. So yeah, they're calling a special session for the explicit purpose of destroying the Democrat-held seat there. Florida is about to do the exact same thing. Ron DeSantis said that if the Supreme Court rules favorably on the Louisiana case, then Florida will redistrict out. They have one minority-majority district in the South Florida metro area, and he literally said, we will dismantle this district if we can. Now, what's interesting is Florida's going to redistrict anyway, regardless of how the court rules, because they think they can get. They're convinced that Hispanics in South Florida have now permanently moved to the right, and a combination of Hispanic migration plus white conservatives that are moving to West Palm Beach and stuff like that is going to result in them being able to flip 2, potentially 3 districts. So Florida's going to do this. North Carolina has announced plans to redraw their maps as well to eliminate the district there in the northeast corner. Ohio has intentionally missed a deadline to redraw on purpose, because if they miss enough deadlines, then the Republicans in the legislature get to redraw the maps however they want. So this is just a stealth way to eliminate 2 Democrat-held seats in Ohio. You see where we're going with this. Nebraska is going to potentially redraw their first district that Don Bacon's vacating, Don Bacon being a Rhino Republican who holds a very blue seat. Well, if they redraw it, we might actually have a shot at holding it. Otherwise, it's going to flip blue. Indiana seems like that they're likely going to do it. This is the second time now that Vance has spoken to them, and it seems very likely that they're going to redraw at least one, if not both, of the Democrats out. You see the trend here. So what this and that doesn't even take into account that the Supreme Court might end up ruling that this second seat in Louisiana is unconstitutional.
And before we get to the big map to show what this actually could mean for the elections, I want to say a big thank you to Lear Capital, who is also a sponsor of this show. Now, one of the reasons why I like Lear Capital is because of their emphasis on education. When it comes to actually owning precious metals like gold, like silver, as part of your portfolio, there's a lot of different ways you can do it, and there's a lot of noise out there. I like the fact that Lear actually takes the time to explain how you can own it physically, which means in person, which means you can't be debanked, or how you can own it as part of a 401k, which again is kind of an easy way to hedge against everything else that happens within the country. Like we've said multiple times before, when the Federal Reserve can just simply print more Federal Reserve notes, you can actually watch the value of your dollar decrease significantly, but that also has an upward pressure on gold. I don't know if you've noticed this lately, but gold is over $4,000 an ounce right now. And so it's getting a little crazy. If you would like to learn more, if you would just like Lear Capital to send you some information, tell you a little bit about how you can make it a part of your portfolio or own it physically in your own safe to where you have access to it, get started by calling Lear at 800-707-4575. That's 800-707-4575. Or you can visit Nick4Lear. That's Nick, the number 4, Lear.com. Again, just reach out. Doesn't cost you anything to go and just get some information and see how you can actually add this to make sure you got a little bit of security in there. A little bit of security in there, because we all know monetary policy is garbage right now. All right, let's go ahead and get back to it. So we've gone through what various states are doing right now. And again, keep in mind, because there's a lot of people that are, look, if you're conservative and you like to be fair-minded, you're like, well, look, Nick, I don't know if this is the right thing to do. I don't know if it's appropriate for us to engage in these sorts of tactics. What needs to be understood is blue states have already been engaging in these kinds of tactics because the VRA doesn't impact them in the same way, right? So red states now coming back. And again, I don't want red states discriminating against minority voters. I don't want that happening. I don't think that's fair. But we've had gerrymandered districts in order to appeal to the VRA. And now we're going to look back again. I hope what the Supreme Court is going to do is they're going to come in, they're going to look at the 14th Amendment. And let me read this off right here, just so we're all clear. I had it up here in a second ago. There we go. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Well, when you have a law that is being interpreted in such a way as to convey an advantage based off of race, you can make a pretty solid argument that that's a violation of the 14th Amendment. And now what you're going to hopefully get is districts which better reflect kind of the geographical areas, the various concerns that come into play when it comes to congressional representation. And again, the Democrats don't like it because they think that it's meant free congressional seats for them. But if all of the states that we just talked about actually go through this process of no longer trying to appeal to a potential article that could be ruled unconstitutional, this is what the map could look like.
Well, no, this is what the map currently is.
We're getting to the point of what it's going to look like, Christian.
So let's play around with some scenarios here. I'll give California their redistricting.
Yeah.
So goodbye, Doug. Goodbye, Kevin.
Yeah, I know Doug.
They hold on to that. They flip Ken's seat in Southern California, and they get rid of Darrell Issa's seat as well. And Young Kim, no relation to Youngkin.
Yeah.
She holds on as the sole Republican left in Southern California. So they pick up 4.
And they have what, 54?
52.
52 congressional seats. 4 of them will be.
Well, they have 52. Yeah, is it 52 seats? It's either 52 or 54. I believe they have 52.
Okay.
Let's confirm. Yeah, it's 52.
So 52.
I was getting the electoral.
And the other thing California has is on their census, they do not put whether or not you're a citizen or not. So they already have more representation than they should have by a pretty large margin.
Yeah, that's an important thing to remember. The fact that non-U.S. citizens are counted for congressional apportionment means that the massive illegal population in a place like California gives California more representatives than they would otherwise have.
So I've given Newsom his gerrymander that he wants.
Yeah.
Now we get to do the same thing for Republicans. So we pick up that 1 extra seat in Texas. The map has already given us the other pickups in Texas. They've already given us the one in Missouri, but we get Kansas back. We get to hold the one in Nebraska. If all these articles go through, just keep that in mind. We do the same thing in Indiana and we crack those. And then we pick up 2 in Ohio. And then we get that 1 extra seat in Northeast North Carolina. And then Ron DeSantis, I'll only give him 2.
Yeah.
You're not going to break Miami. It'd be 3. I actually did click the minority majority district, but that just because it's the larger one.
Yeah.
That's the one that Florida's going to wait to eliminate depending on how the court rules. But if you do all of that, you start, remember, we still have all these other swing districts everywhere, right? You know, a bunch of like toss-ups. You start with Republicans already at a majority.
Mm-hmm.
You start with them having an absolute majority.
Yeah.
Before any toss-up seats in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan are even taken into consideration, we already have a majority.
And that's without even fixing Louisiana or Georgia or Alabama.
Yes.
Or Mississippi.
You're really perceptive on that. So we started this podcast talking about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and what's going on in Louisiana and its implications. So imagine if the Supreme Court overturned that and the southern states are allowed to redraw. Here's what would happen. South Carolina would eliminate their Democrat seat. Georgia would eliminate their rural Democrat seat in the Black Belt. Alabama would eliminate both of their Democrat seats. Mississippi would eliminate their Democrat seat. Louisiana would get rid of not just the second one that they had to draw, they'd get rid of both of them. And then Tennessee would eliminate their sole Democrat in Memphis. Oh, whoops. I got the one in Arkansas by mistake. So if you did that, and now since I'm OCD, we're going to fix that Arkansas seat. If you did that, we would be at 227.
Yeah. And 227 gives a lot more leeway.
And that's before the toss-ups.
And that's before any of the actual competitive seats. So we're talking about a fundamental shift in the structure of the House of Representatives. Like the median seat would be moved significantly to the right. And what this would do is a lot of people talk about how, and I've done this before a few times, and arguably it's inappropriate or incorrect to do so. A lot of people talk about how this would permanently destroy the Democratic Party. No, it would permanently destroy the Democratic Party as it currently exists as a force for the progressive omnicause.
Yeah. As a leftist woke entity, it would have to adjust or die.
They would have to shift to the right in order to become competitive again, which is what we want. The way that you win, we're never going to get a situation where the Democratic Party's outlawed and they just don't exist. And I mean, I love to joke all the time, like, we can have democracy without the Democratic Party. But the fact of the matter is that we have a two-party system. And so the way that you win is you shift the Overton window so far in your direction that the other party has to operate within the old Overton window. That's how you win. The Republican Party today is more progressive than either party was 60 years ago.
That's true.
Well, that's how the left is really won.
And it's unfortunate.
And the other big shift that you're seeing right now is that for the longest time, for as long as I've been alive, with the exception of maybe the early and mid 80s. I was born in 79. I know I'm old. But if you looked at the 80s, there was this shift to what you call the Ronald Reagan moral majority and things of that nature. But even then, structurally, the United States was still, it felt like it was moving more toward the left. Now, you had that instance. I'm old enough to remember when Bill Clinton stood up at the Democratic National Convention and said, the era of big government is over. And the reason why he said that is because Reagan's coalition had been so popular and it had been seen to be on the ascendancy that it felt as if that was true and that the Democrats were actually adopting that. Now, when Bill Clinton got into office, he did not govern that way. He tried to nationalize health care. He tried to do all sorts of things. And there was such a backlash that Republicans actually took control of the House of Representatives for the first time in like 40 years, over 40 years. And then Bill Clinton started to moderate. But as time went on, you started to see, especially within our university system, within our education system, you started to see this shift to the left. You got this bump in patriotism during the Bush administration with September 11th. But then Bush was a compassionate conservative, which was basically a way of saying he was a big government conservative. And he started doing all sorts of things, from No Child Left Behind to Medicaid to Part D. He was doing all of these things to actually expand government power in a way that liberals wanted, in a way to appease liberals, and they hated him for it. They absolutely hated him for it. And we started shifting more and more left, and then Obama became this radical shift to the left. And the end result is that no matter what happened, the Republican response was always, oh my gosh, could you imagine if the shoe was on the other foot? Oh, we can't do that. It'll set a dangerous precedent. Even when Trump came into his first term, what did he do? He had this idea that he was going to drain the swamp. And he convinced a critical mass of the electorate to vote for him a majority to vote for him to drain the swamp. And then he surrounded himself with a bunch of people who knew how the swamp worked. And I think Trump's theory was, I want to drain the swamp. I'm going to bring people to show me how it works, and then we're going to drain it together. And what he found out is that they had no interest in draining the swamp because they had built their careers on sustaining the swamp and navigating the swamp. And they didn't want to fundamentally change it. And then what happened? You had a combination of COVID and the Biden administration where the left lurched as far to the left as possible because they felt like, this was the right kind of giving their last gasp. This was their high water mark. And we beat them. And now we're going to use lawfare. We're going to do lockdowns. We're going to do everything we want. We're going to push the trans issue as hard as we can. We're going to push all of our issues. And then there was a massive backlash. And the next time Trump came back, he came back not with people that understood how DC worked. He came back with people that were every bit as dedicated to drain the swamp as he was. And because he came back so overwhelmingly, you had a lot of these other Republicans that were always a little bit scared on the state level, or always a little bit scared in their little congressional seat. And now they've got the message that if you're not willing to play hardball, if you're just going to sit here at a safe distance and be like, oh, well, you could imagine what would happen. Shut up. The precedent's already been set. And while we don't want to give up our values, we expect you to use the authority you have to reflect what your constituents want. And if you're not willing to do it, we'll get rid of you and replace you with someone who will next election cycle. And more Republican governors and more Republican attorney generals and more Republican senators and congressmen are learning that's the new dynamic. You don't win by appealing to suburban liberals hoping that they'll like you. They don't. You're either going to stand up and do what's necessary within the boundaries of the Constitution. A lot of this stuff should have been done a long time ago. Or we'll get rid of you and replace you with someone who will. Because we've seen what the left is willing to do when they have power. They're not afraid to use it. They're not afraid to do things which we would argue completely violate, if not the letter of the Constitution, certainly the spirit of it. You better at least be willing to do the things within your power, within the Constitution, to actually protect what it is we all care about. And that's what we see starting to transpire right now. And I'm here for it. I voted for this. Christian, you got any closing thoughts on this one?
Let's hope the Supreme Court does the right thing. Because if it does, this is how you permanently shift the country to the right.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party, if they want to remain politically relevant under this type of scenario right here, right? If they want to ever have a chance of winning a majority back, they would have to move to the right to flip existing Republican seats.
Well, my final thought on this will be the Democrats are going to claim that this is all about racism. No, it isn't. What this is about is recognizing that what the objective has been is equality before the law. And Democrats don't get to continue to use and manipulate the law in order to achieve not better outcomes for minorities. If that was the case, the districts they represented as Democrats would be doing a whole lot better than they are. This is about, once again, recognizing the equal protection under the law means equal protection for everyone under the law. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to True Classic and Lear Capital for both sponsoring this episode. Go check them out. Once again, the conversation doesn't end here. We're about to go into post-game. So if you're someone that would be interested in asking questions as we're going through this process, not to mention the other sometimes spicier conversations which happen once we enter post-game, go check out the link in the description. We'd love to have you join our community. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.